Okay, so thanks for doing your pre-work. Let's start with the benchmark questions that you pulled out. So what knowledge and skills do we see coming out of these problems?
So the first question was, third grade students made a graph of their favorite subject, used the graph to complete the sentence. There are blank students who like reading and math more than writing. I think just like the basic knowledge is like how to read a graph. Like the bars each represent different values. Bars represent different values. I think like what the scale is going up by, like how to read a scale and like what does a scale represent. In the context of this like question, like in this case it's their favorite subject, so that the scale represents students. Skills, I think, is reading the graph, obviously, like reading the scale.
And with that too, there's like the intervals, right, which may not, like they may need to know how to find what is halfway between.
So reading intervals. Yeah. And then like it gets really complex because it's like who like reading and math more than writing. So I guess like a skill would be combine like two-step word problems in graphs. So like combining these two things and then subtracting. So like solving basic addition and subtraction two-step problems.
Yep. And when we look, I know you looked at the flipbook too for your pre-work. When we get there, they have some like sample stems. I think it would be powerful at the end of the standard to talk through like all the different types of questions they might encounter, so that we're making sure we're covering everything in our unit.
Yep. There's like finding the total, like the total number of students, like what was the interval used. Okay. How many more like basic one step, like how many more nonfiction rather than fantasy.
Yeah.
Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah. We can, when we do the flip book, we can come back to that and kind of make sure we're covering our bases. But
and the next question was, third grade students made a graph of the type of pet they have at home. Use the graph below to complete the sentence. There are blank more students who have dogs than birds. So I think this is like a simpler version of the first one. So like scaffolding from this one to that one, like first solving like basic, like extrapolating and then making it into two-step.
So that would be an instructional strategy probably.
Okay, so start with one-step problems from graphs. Move to two-step. Cool. And then last one was, the school is selling items to raise money. Hassan made a chart of how many people bought certain items, and we have to help him make the chart, or make the graph. So I think that's the hardest in terms of like its creation, and it's like taking info. So they have to, the skill is like, how do you make a scale and like how do you determine intervals? So like how to determine scale and interval, like how do you know if you have to start at 0 or you have to start like 100?
And what would the like instructional implications be of needing to teach them?
I think making sure that we move from like looking at graphs to creating our own. So I think it'd be kind of cool to do like a student-based, like we could collect data and then like make our own graphs, just like he did. Like he had a chart and then you had to like make a graph. That could be powerful. So like collect our own data and make a chart and then make a graph. So I think that's important to have both.
Yeah. What about for like that determining the scale and the interval? How might we get at that?
I think like maybe in our key points, like asking like, does it make sense? Like what is the smallest unit? Like what is the biggest one? And then like, what would it make sense to go up by? Like what's the easiest or like most logical way? So.
And to make that more concrete, I can imagine too, like showing them the same information presented in different graphs with different intervals. To show how, like, I guess the knowledge, will ask you, like, I'll let you type and then I'll ask you.
With different intervals. Okay.
What would the, like, knowledge takeaways be from doing that?
That you can have different intervals but still represent the same data. So, like, graphs can show the same data in different ways.
Yeah.
Graphs can show, I think that's really powerful, same data in different ways. So, like, different intervals. Okay, cool. I think also, like, not all graphs have to start at 0. Like, you could start at, like, a bigger number if you need to.
Yeah. And then, does this standard explicitly call it? It does, yeah, picture graphs or pictographs. None of our benchmark problems have to do with that, but we can imagine.
I found some when I was making the assessment, and it asks like if the star represents like 5 books, then like how many more?
The assessment.
Yeah. Let's see. It's like how many fewer students had blue eyes than brown and green. So it's really similar to these bar graphs, except now it's like your circle in this graph is worth 3 students. So like I could see them just like subtracting 5 minus 3 and just calling it a day.
Yeah. So then the knowledge and skills there
is knowledge that like in a picture graph, each symbol could represent a different, like a certain value depending on the key. Oh, I guess a skill would be like how to use a key, like how to find the key and use it before trying to answer a question.
Yeah.
Okay. And then,
and then answer this similar set of questions.
Yeah.
That will generate. Okay. So let's look at flipbook.
I like that it said like for graphs like PCAI, like pose a question, collect data, analyze the data, interpret data. I think that kind of goes with what we just said. Like if they create their own bar graphs, like that's probably the most like powerful way for them to internalize it.
Yeah. And what I like about that too is by like posing a question at the beginning, it puts it into context more too. So it's like you're not just making a graph and then answering questions about it, like you are interpreting at the end, but you're actually like making the graph to answer a question, which is like why you would make a graph to begin with. So where would that go?
I think in instructional strategies, like just add on like PCAI, like pose a question, collect data, analyze it, and interpret it. I think that could be a good lesson objective.
Yeah.
And then it included like using both horizontal and vertical bar graphs. I think a skill is like learning to read both.
Yeah.
It might be hard for them, one or the other, both vertical and horizontal.
There's a section with the vocab there too, right before horizontal and vertical graphs, so right here.
Okay, title, scale, categories. So those are all, I think, skills. Like, what is the title, scale?
Yeah, it's cross knowledge and skills. It's like knowing what those are,
and then how to use them.
Yeah.
And what is data? I think that's a good knowledge point. Like, what is data? Like, why do we care about data?
Yeah. Yeah, so much like real world application here.
And then there's questions that we talked about, like what we could use to like push them. I think it'd be cool to have them create their own questions eventually, like after they've had practice, like they could make their own questions for their own graphs and then switch or something.
Yeah, questions on the front end to make the graph or to interpret the data?
Interpret, to interpret it.
Cool. Yeah, I think that'd be great. Let's take time now then to like generate stems. We could even put it in the question stems.
Okay. Let's see. So if you were like talking about books, like about how many books are read in all. So they'd have to like count up all the values.
And the word about, I wonder if that's looking for rounding as well.
That's true. Rounding up to the nearest like interval. That could be interesting to like push them.
We might want to flag that.
Round to the nearest interval. Yeah, that's a good real world application. I don't want to know like exactly how many books. Like I want to know like about how many.
Yeah.
Because there's so many.
Yeah.
Okay, that's cool. And then, this is good. What type of book was read more often than a mystery, but less often than a fairy tale? So like having to really like critically look at the bars.
Yeah. It's like finding a value in between two other values.
So more often than A, but less than B. That's very interesting.
We've got like the basic comparisons. Like, did more people choose X or Y?
Mm-hmm.
How many more chose X than Y?
I think that goes back to the standard. Like, that's what the standard, like, explicitly said, too.
Yeah.
Like, how many more questions? Like,
Mm-hmm.
so making sure that I include those, how many more? And then, so, like we said, like, start with 1 step, move on to 2 step.
Thinking about the 2-step ones, because those are sometimes harder to generate.
Mm-hmm.
Like, do we have any kind of general frames that we could use for those?
What do you mean?
Some like sentence frames, right?
Oh,
for
sentence frames. Yeah.
For what a question would be like.
I like this one. How many more people chose blank than blank and blank? So that's like the than implies the subtraction, but then the and is like you like they know that they need to add them together. I think that's a good one.
So there's like a comparison happening, but first combining the values.
Yep. And then maybe the opposite. So like first they add and then they subtract, like just to mix it. I don't want them to like just expect it, you know, like oh, these 2 numbers I have to add them.
Yeah.
So like how many more or how many less maybe like chose blank and blank than blank. So just like mixing it up and making sure it's like actually conceptual.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think thinking about those, there's some additional knowledge, like understanding pieces that they need to have, right? Which are, what would you say, like, you can...
I think just the knowledge that, like, questions can sometimes involve more than one part, which is, like, building off of, obviously, like, our, like, first units of, like, place value and, like, understanding addition and, like, subtraction and stuff. But,
I would agree with that. And then I would also say, like, you can, it's about, like, ways to manipulate the data, right? So, like, you can combine values or compare them.
So, like, data is malleable. Like, you can, like, look at it in many different ways. That's a good knowledge. Okay. And then I think the skill, it goes back to, like, 2-step word problems almost. Like, maybe we can use those key points to, like, help us with these key points. But, like, understanding, is it 2-part or is it 2-step? Like, going back to that. And then, like, what do you need first before you do this?
Yeah. Yeah, especially because these are, like, which one is it? 2-step, where the first question is implicit, and they need to make that inference to figure out.
Yeah, none of them are 2-part.
Yeah.
It's really cool. And then, like, even they could write the equation of, like they could literally just use all the 2-step word problem key points and just be like, okay, like, write the equation first and then do it and see if you can find, like, where the parentheses go. Using parentheses. I guess that would be an instructional strategy. Like, equations. Oh, it said that students should begin each scale with 0, so never mind what I said earlier.
Yeah, interesting that they call it skip counting as, like, the way that you determine your intervals.
Yeah, that could be good to, like, relate it back to what we already learned about patterns.
Yeah, in unit planning, when we think about, like, sticky key points, we want to think about, like, how do you skip count to create your intervals. I want to go back to this last question, something I think is interesting. Because it sort of has to do with, like, applying what's in the graph to a new situation. So I think about, you know, something like this or something that's, like, probability, right? Like, which is not what this particular example is based on, but, like, if you were to pull another marble out, what would you be most likely to get based on what the graph has shown you?
Like, making an educated, like, prediction based off the data.
Exactly.
I like that. So I guess maybe just, like, the knowledge is, like, what would make the most sense? Like, would you buy, like, the least popular book, or would you buy the most popular? Like, oh, we want to buy, like, the most popular book.
Yeah, and it uses, like, the context of the problem, which in this case is popularity of book. And you have to know that, like, in that case, if you're purchasing a book, you would want to cater to, like, the popularity of it.
Yeah.
But we can imagine if the context of the problem changes, like, that would look totally different. So what would you say then, like, big picture is the
I think
type
like
of question there?
The type of question would be, like, if you wanted to blank, like,
Mhm.
which would you choose? Which would you choose? And like applying, like just make a note, like apply to like what the graph is about, and like use best judgment. So like maybe even explaining that, like what does that mean? Like how do we, like why do we make graphs? Like to make life easier is like how do we use them?
Yeah.
And going back to the why.
Yeah. Anything in the instructional strategies part we haven't already hit?
Oh, I think drawing picture graphs as well. Like we talked about
Mhm.
creating bar graphs, but also creating our own picture graphs.
Yeah.
And like practicing making it key.
Mhm. And I think going along with interpreting those, they need to, it kind of calls it out here, like multiplication facts, like they need to either multiply or skip count. Like they, in order to read the scaled picture graph, they need to have some go-to skill in order to do that. And then for NWEA, I know you pulled those out. Talk to me about what you're thinking with those.
It looks like we will be hitting like the applying like analysis to real world problems. I think like if we like have them make their own graphs and like making sure that we're applying it to them, and then solving simple problems involving measurement of length, like I could see us like in these graphs like incorporating like distance and like length in them to like hit it implicitly.
Yeah, it's interesting that they call that out explicitly as like the type of measurement units that they want you to be manipulating. Obviously, the next standard calls that out too, with the line plots. So that aligns well. But any knowledge or skills, or I guess I should say like knowledge, aligned to those skills that we haven't captured yet?
I guess going back to like how do we use graphs in like our real like daily life? Like why would they help us solve these like real world problems? Like they would need to know like why we create graphs and like what's the purpose behind a picture graph versus a bar graph.
Yeah. Yeah, and then the other thing that I see, especially in the 75th percentile, is around like the conversion of units, which like doesn't quite fit with what the standard explicitly calls for, and it doesn't quite fit with MD4 either. But like as you saw, you pulled out, like this would be the place to hit it since we are going to be manipulating units of length.
It can be interesting to have them like convert values like once they get their answer to like push them and be like, okay, let's convert this answer into like, because if we're dealing with inches, feet, and yard, like making our graphs somehow like relate to that, and then like converting our answers just for like that extra push.
Yeah,
because that's what they need to get to the 75%.
Yeah, and there's a nice tie-in too with like the scale of the graph, so you can imagine like, and you know we talked about like comparing graphs the same information, like doing one in feet and one in yards or inches. Would kind of bring it all together. You can imagine like a performance task or something.
That'd be cool. To that. Comparing graphs with the same data on different scales. Yeah, I think that'd be a really good push.
And the underlying skills with that, like once we get to unit planning, we'll have to grapple with like how do we integrate that since it is a slightly different set of skills. And I know like the 4th grade standard calls it out really specifically, which is why it's in the 75th percentile, but we can think about how we want to start pushing towards that. Okay. MD4. Go back to the benchmark. Not a lot of benchmark questions here.
I think it's pretty like straightforward. It looks like they just want them to interpret the data and make a line plot. But what looks hard is like halves of an inch and fourths of an inch. So like, I don't know, I guess the knowledge that you can like separate units into halves, and so like it's like fractions and like line plots. So like the knowledge that like you can split units into fractional form or like fractional parts. and then the skill of how to do that. Like,
Yeah.
how do you, like, yeah, I can see that being hard.
Yeah, and I think to break that down even more, because I mean, you could go into, you know, thirds and things like that, but the standard just calls for like halves and fourths. So I think there's a piece of knowledge of like what is a half of a unit, what is a fourth of a unit.
I think a skill would be like skip counting by fourths. So like having them practice like how to do that.
Yeah, because they'll need to do that in order to label their line plot, in order to like read the ruler properly. It's also interesting that these objects that they're measuring don't all start at 0, nor do they all start at a whole number.
Yep. So that's really tricky. So I guess a skill is like how to read a ruler when they're measuring, like the object doesn't start at 0.
Yeah.
So I guess in our key points when we do them, they'd have to be like, I don't know, they have to go beyond just like start at 0, like how far does it go? It'd have to be like, where does it start? Like, okay, how many units like did we travel?
Yeah, which that last piece of what you said really hits on like the knowledge there, like what is length?
Yeah. What is length?
What would you say it is?
Like length is the distance between 2 points, not necessarily 0, but 2 points.
Yeah.
Okay, that'd be a good key point to hit.
Yeah, and that goes along well with just like difference and comparison problems, which is like a big deal in second grade, which they may or may not have gotten strongly since Common Core's new.
I think also like frequency, like like they need to the skill of like what is frequency, like when you say like this is a line plot, they are used to measure frequency, like I could see them just being like, I don't know what you want me to do.
Yes.
What is frequency? Like why you need it. I guess that's more of knowledge.
And then what about the skills of like actually making the line plot?
I think knowing like back to like the graphs, like your scale, like first of all, like how do you know you're going up by like, because this is like some of the denominators are 2, some of them are 4, so like, but you're still going up by fourths. I could see that being like you need to know how to convert fractions, like like 2 fourths is going to change to 1/2, and you need to know that in order to like understand and interpret and make these graphs or line plots rather.
Yeah, it's a huge underlying skill.
So like skills are, well, skip counting by fourths, I already said, but also like converting halves or converting fourths into halves as fractions. So like 2 fourths would change to 1/2 on this graph. And then after you made the scale, you have to know like the number of times something shows up represents an X. I don't know how to like say that, but like what is frequency? Like frequency is the number of times. Like you don't necessarily need like all these kids' names. You just need like the heights of their plants. And so like plotting how many times a value occurs.
And with a problem like this one, you've also got like the frequency table, like the tally chart to read, which they will have been taught in previous grades, but it is still an underlying skill, like knowing that each tally means one is one.
And then maybe like they have to know that sometimes there won't be any like X's.
But it still needs a place on the scale.
Yeah.
It's a big one.
I think like a good way to address that is just like what we're doing, like scale first. Like if they draw the scale first, there's no way they'd forget that.
Yeah. There's a connection to a number line as well.
That's true.
which can be a good tie-in.
Oh, like show it to them without like frequencies first.
Yeah.
Oh, that'd be a cool instructional strategy. Like show line plot without anything but scale and ask what it is.
And because if they make that connection, like they would never make a number line and skip values. So if their first step is always make a number line, then plot your values. That will help mitigate that. The standard explicitly calls out like, where is it? Is it? Maybe not. Maybe I saw it in the flip book, which we can jump to now. But like rounding or measuring to the nearest half.
Oh yeah, it's right here.
Fourth.
Measure objects near dust to the nearest half of an inch or 1/4 of an inch. I think that's really good because then like when they see it or have to like make a graph, like they'll know what a half inch is. Whereas like if we were to just introduce the line plot, they'd be like, I don't know what that is, but I'm gonna plot it because you said so.
Yeah.
Okay, so flip book. So instructional strategies is like measure things to the nearest half and 1/4 inch.
What is the knowledge that goes along with that?
I think fractional parts, like understanding like what is a half, what is a fourth. And then like 2/4 make up a half, which they would ideally see when they did it. And that would help them with that conversion thing we talked about.
What about the fact that it's like to the nearest half or 1/4 inch and it may not be exact?
Maybe rounding would be something like a knowledge, like knowing you can, it's still just like rounding that we covered, like you still have to go back or like forward depending.
And it's great that you taught rounding with a number line because it will just, it's the same like visual process.
Yeah, that'd be good. Because that's true, like in real life, they would have to like figure out like not everything's gonna be perfect, so they have to know like should I go up? That'd be a good like real world connection. Oh, it says right here measuring is approximate. Yep. Oh, I like that they said making paper rulers. I think that could be a really good instructional strategy, like to find the half and 1/4 marks. Yeah,
and build concepts of what those actually mean. Connect to different fractional parts, as you said.
I think it's cool that they would measure and create their line plot. So like using maybe their rulers that they make to like measure and create other things, and so like it's just all tied in together.
Yeah,
that could be kind of cool.
Yeah.
Collect the length data and then plot it, plot the frequencies.
And then it's interesting, like nowhere does it really call out answering questions based on the line plot, but we could imagine.
Yeah, that would be a good way to push them.
Yeah, especially if we're following that PC AI structure, like should be doing that with this too.
Like interpreting it. That's true.
Oh, and we are right at time, so I will stop us there, but we will come back to this.
Okay, cool.